Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Big Bros podcast. My name is Ilan and I'm joined by my lovely friend and co-host Jeremy for episode 60. How are we?
I'm well, mate. I'm really excited about this one. We're going to be talking about masculinity, what it means to us, what we think defines being a good man, a true man, true to your values, who our role models have been, and how we're kind of viewing masculinity in society today. What are the problems with it? What are the great things about it? And just our overall judgments and opinions on it.
I think it's pretty topical. Yesterday there was a march against gender-based violence, given the concerning increased trend of, male perpetrated violence against women. And I think given the prospect of our show, which is, aimed at mentorship, talking about masculinity, also talking about, what it means to be a man, I think now is probably a pretty timely period to speak about this topic, because I do think for a large part there's been a bit of a crisis with how people have conceptualized masculinity. I think nowadays it's very confusing to be a man. I think there's mixed messaging socially with what it is to be a man, what it means to be a healthy man versus what it means to be a toxic male. So there's a lot of things to unpack here, but I think it's still a very important topic.
Yeah, I like the point you make about it being confusing. I think that's the best way to describe it. I think there's times where I feel properly confused about what it means to be a man. And I think I've really had to sit down, like actually physically sit down, think about what it means for me. What are the values that I want to live by, and what are the values that I want to try get better in to be a man, to be a better man in my perspective, because it has been confusing. You see so much reported about, toxic masculinity, and I guess, being a lot more vulnerable and emotional as a man today, which, is important, but I think it's also important to an extent, which we will discuss. And I think it's left a lot of people confused, me included. So I think that's a key reason why we want to talk about this today, because hopefully it'll help you guys come up with, I guess, your perspectives on what it means to be a man for you, if you are a man listening. And, if you are female, then maybe thinking about what are the qualities that you might want to look for in a man, whether that be romantically or as a friend.
I think you mentioned it's confusing because there's been so many extremes, and two really main extremes. So I'm going to start with one. There's the one that looks at masculinity as inherently toxic, and that inherently toxic masculinity is at the root cause of gender-based violence. It's at the cause of any issue for males. For example, males having high rates of suicide, more men engaging in risky behaviors, and an overall myriad of issues. More men in prison. So linking all of those negative outcomes with the true form of masculinity as being negative and toxic, and gender roles as being a negative thing for society, and therefore perpetuating a lot of issues for men in today's world. And then you've got the other end of the extreme, which is the Andrew Tate phenomenon that rose a few years ago. And what happens with extremes is that it tends to elicit a counter extreme, because that's how these things tend to work. Where there's a cultural revolution, there tends to be a countercultural revolution as well. And Andrew Tate filled that role, because I think for a lot of men, say what you will about him, he said some really awful and terrible things, and he said some things where you could say, yeah, he's probably right about that. The whole saying, a broken clock is right about twice. I think I butchered that.
But he broken clock's right twice.
And I think he was very appealing to a lot of men who, I think, got sick of being told that there is an innate problem with their masculinity. There is an innate problem with the fact that they're a man. Which in turn
turned them to be the complete opposite, which was the other end of the continuum,
exactly,
which is Andrew Tate.
And the same continuum. And then the problem is you then turn to someone like Andrew Tate, who, sure, will tell you there's nothing wrong with being a man, but then he'll go on and preach about a bunch of other things about how men should have multiple wives and they should, conquer the world like Genghis Khan and
just
shit like that.
Type stuff.
And the thing is, it's very appealing for a man who never had a positive male role model. It's very positive. It's very appealing for a man who may have been burnt by females in the past and needed guidance. And the problem is, extremes tend to never be correct. They tend to not be the the healthiest model to live your life by. But what it does show is that there's probably a masculinity crisis in terms of what it is to be a man. I think you're right. You said that you had to sit down physically and think about what it is to be a man. Whilst I haven't sat down, I've definitely thought about it a lot. I've reflected on it, because there's elements of being a man that I think you can borrow from two ends of those, the Andrew Tate extreme and then the other extreme that we spoke about earlier. And we'll get into that, but yeah.
Yeah, I think the problem with these extremes is that it brings out the worst in people. I don't think it brings out the positive of a side. Like if you're taking an extreme, you're obviously just going to appeal to one side, which is a complete extremist view with no room for growth, no room for development. So too, we've said, the Andrew Tate side is one end of that spectrum, which is bad by nature. The other end of that spectrum, I would say, is that toxic masculinity definition that, men are innately bad, and I think that also is absolutely rubbish, in my opinion. I think the term toxic masculinity speaks of saying that basically, if you're saying someone is toxic, or if you're saying masculinity is toxic, you're saying that masculinity in and of itself is toxic, which by definition, but as being a man, is rubbish. Men are not toxic in nature. Masculinity is not toxic in nature. We need masculine energy in order for survival, in order for procreation, in order for true relationships to form. We need masculinity. We need masculine energy. And, that's not to say that females don't have masculine energy as well, because they do. They might not have masculine energy to the extent of some men, but, just like some males have feminine energy, so too do females have masculine energy. So by calling masculinity toxic as a whole, you're doing a disservice to the whole of society. And that's my problem with toxic masculinity, is you can't just stamp something out as being completely negative like that, especially when it's something innate to you as a male or you as a female, because it's within all of us.
My issue with people with the whole idea about toxic masculinity is because it's actually a mischaracterization of what masculinity is. It's saying that aggression that's perpetrated by males is therefore a toxic masculine quality. Aggression that's not controlled is not a masculine quality. If anything, it's the complete opposite. True masculinity comes from being found in strength, and it's tempered with empathy and courage guided by wisdom. What that means at the same time is being able to control your emotions, being able to control any impulse you've got, and being a gentle person when necessary, being a compassionate person when necessary, but using your strength wisely and in a responsible way. A true man does that. A coward doesn't. So anyone who says that those elements of masculinity is somehow toxic, well, you're throwing out the baby out with the bathwater, aren't you? Because you can't pick and choose. You can't label the whole idea of masculinity, which is
as toxic.
It's the same thing. You wouldn't call it toxic femininity either. There's a lot of women out there who perpetrate a lot of heinous acts, right? But you don't go out and then label femininity as therefore inherently toxic. It just doesn't work like that.
Of course, there are traits that are possessed by some men that are toxic, right? And they possess, and act on traits that are extremely toxic, but it doesn't mean, like we've said, that masculinity is toxic as a whole. Like you've said, so too with femininity. Plenty of women out there that do heinous acts on men. Plenty of women that, also murder and that also rape and commit all these atrocious acts. Doesn't mean femininity is toxic, because it's not.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think as well, a lot of people look at gender roles, especially for men, and say that there's a social pressure for men to conform, to be the breadwinners, to be the ones that go out into the workforce, make the money.
And on the other side, for females to be the nurturers, the homemakers, the stay-at-home people.
Correct. And there's a bit of a phenomenon now where it's almost demonized, even though that's the structure that's sustained us for as long as the human civilization has existed, right? And the problem there is you shouldn't necessarily demonize something just because it has just because it has problems with it, because it's like a yin and yang sort of thing. You've got masculine energy, you've got feminine energy. At the same time, gender roles have been effective for that sort of reason. Are they perfect? No. Can they create issues in some cases? 100%. But for the most part, it's been an effective thing.
When we think of the foundational structure and core pillars of it.
Of society, yeah. And I think, look, the truth of the matter is if someone doesn't want to conform to these gender roles or norms, they don't have to. And they shouldn't have to, because you live in a free society, and that's fine. You live your life how you want to. But to go out and demonize it and say that it's not effective for men, it's not healthy for men, I think a lot of men find a lot of courage and purpose knowing that they have a role and duty to perform as a man.
Yeah, I think the problem is, like you said, when people demonize it, when people say, what doesn't work for me shouldn't work for you. That's the problem here, is when one side takes an extremist view and says that, tradition is bullshit because, we're modernizing ourselves now in our way of living, and therefore everyone should act that way. Everyone should change their way of living just because that's what works for me. One thing that, we've seen in society is that we live in a very diverse society now where variety is a very much encouraged thing. Variety, diversification, ways of living that are different from one person to the next is very much welcomed and very much how we live today. So by virtue of that, wouldn't it make sense that you don't need to do something the way someone else might do it, and therefore you shouldn't demonize them for doing it their way? What works for you might not work for someone else.
I think, yeah, you're right. But I think the issue is that people pin all of these negative things. So the gender-based violence committed against women, they pin that against, for example, masculinity being evil. The gender roles have somehow had a contributing role to these things. And I think you'd agree with me here. What is at the cause of these things, or could be a plausible explanation, isn't that masculinity is evil, but it's a lack of masculine role models. It's someone that's never taught a man what it means to be a person, be a good human, first of all,
and how to treat women,
how to control your emotions, how to be a strong and protective individual, but know how to temper that strength. No, with great power comes great responsibility. So what does that mean? It means that men who are strong, who have the power to hurt others, don't hurt others. They know how to apply that strength when necessary, and they protect others as well. And that could be considered a gender role as well, that men are, the protectors of society. Does anyone have an issue with getting rid of that as a role? Because I think a lot of people appreciate that role that men have fulfilled in society.
Yeah, I mean, it's like when you see in the old school movies about, when you see maybe like a woman might slap a man across the face, but the man won't slap them back. That's that whole protection thing that, you shouldn't hit. And of course you shouldn't hit. But therefore, I think that just shows that maybe as men, that's what it is to be a man, is to be taught that you shouldn't use violence. You shouldn't use aggression, because that's not being a man and that's not strong. And like you've said, coming back to the whole, gender-based violence type of discussion going on now, is that these men just probably have never been taught. They've never had that role model to teach them, don't use your hands, don't use verbal, hatred and, bigotry and things like that. Control your emotions. Don't be at the whim of your emotions. Take a breather, calm down, and then act accordingly based on that. And that's not to excuse these men for doing these heinous acts. Absolutely not. Because nobody should commit these acts, male or female. Violence, domestic violence, sexual assaults, all of that is obviously disgusting. And it doesn't matter who you are, committing that is just always going to be disgusting. So, it's not an excuse, but it's rather an observation that these people probably just have never been taught correctly, have never had those proper male role models amongst them to teach them right from wrong, which is something we pity. It's shameful, and it's sad that these people are going around and therefore committing these heinous acts. So maybe it's something more of education. And
do you think it's helpful as a man, you're in your formative period, you turn on the news and all you hear about is how evil men are, how toxic you are on the inside. It's going to demonize you more and more, and it's not an effective strategy. I just don't think it's an effective thing for young men to be hearing that at their core, they have a toxic element, they have a rotten element, and that they need to temper that. And the truth of the matter is, if I'm a man and I'm hearing that, I'm thinking...
Well, you're scared to speak.
I'm scared to speak, number one. But number two, I'm like, What can I do? What does it mean to be a man? And then, put this into a dating context, right? I've got to ask you this. Is being a masculine man in a relationship, in a straight relationship, an effective thing? Is it gonna be a disservice to you? Does a man need to have a few more feminine qualities? Like, if you're hearing all this as a young boy who doesn't know, who's hearing mixed messages from, pop culture, what do they do?
Exactly. Well, it's what do you do and who do you turn to? Because I can assure you now, there's probably plenty of men listening that are probably scared to, get the door for, their, the person that they're on a date with. They're scared about whether they should foot the bill on the first date because, is that equality? Should it be split? Should the female now pay? How do I know which route to go down? Because, you hear all these mixed messages about, a lot of women, wanting to be even Stevens, wanting that split, not wanting the door being held for them, not wanting the man to walk on the side of the road when walking along the nature strip, because that's that protective element. A lot of women don't want that and voice that. So as a man, you're thinking, well, this is just chivalrous behavior, and this is chivalry that has lasted for many years. And, a lot of these qualities is what it means, I feel, to be a man, to be that protector, to be that, nurturer of your female counterpart, to look after them. And, these are qualities that...
How dare you? So evil.
I think it's bullshit. I think it's rubbish. And it upsets me that, a lot of men feel like they can't be that way anymore. And a lot of women kind of want to take that away from men, because there are plenty of feminine qualities that men love to see in females and want to date in females. And it would be shameful for us to say, get rid of those feminine qualities. I want to date someone more blokey. And to each their own. You can date whoever you want, but I think when you start to change people and you start to demonize certain characteristics that have for centuries worked and have for centuries built foundational love, that's where the problem lies.
At the end of the day, when you get a girlfriend, Jeremy, if you ask them, do you want to know that I'm able to protect you? They're going to say yes. If you ask them, do you think it's an attractive quality? They'll say yes. If you ask them, do you want and prefer me to take the initiative when we create certain dates? Obviously, we find what we want to do together, but I take initiative with certain things. Do you find that to be an attractive quality? She will say yes.
Yep.
So the fact of the matter is there is a loud minority of people, probably within a subsection of a feminist community, that want to tear down a lot of what they believe is chivalrous, because they associate it with gender roles. They associate it with this evil, patriarchal system that was developed to try and keep women down. And look, you can have whatever views you want, but I think if you look at things in a very simplistic sense, what you just mentioned here about being chivalrous, about being a gentleman, most people appreciate those qualities.
I think they do, because I know myself personally, I've never gone on a date where the woman has raised their eyebrows at me being chivalrous. It's always been something that's been thanked. It's been something that's been welcomed. It's been something that's appreciated. Picking them up on the date, dropping them home, getting the door for them, footing the bill on that first date, organizing the date, taking initiative, taking lead. It's never been something problematic, at least for the women that, I've dated and had experiences dating. And that's been great. Maybe I've been lucky that I haven't, come across the averse side of those things. But you know what? If I did come across the averse side of those things, I just know that it therefore isn't for me, and they're not for me, because our qualities differ. But I think it goes to show that for the vast majority, it is appreciated. And like you said, it's the minority that are voicing these things, that want to change these things. And because it is such a minority, we shouldn't allow it to happen, because the majority of women wouldn't want that to happen. I think the majority of women like chivalry and like to feel that protection and like a man taking initiative. And I think, in my earlier days of dating, when I was, 18, 19 years old and still learning the ropes, still learning about how to do this game, I think I used to be a lot more passive in my approach. I used to come across as a lot more, do you want to do this? Shall we do this? What time suits you? blah, blah, blah. Like a lot of more questioning, a lot more doubtful type actions from my end, because I wanted to make sure that everything was agreed upon. But I soon learned that actually deterred women, and that wasn't actually attracting women to me, because that was coming across as dependent. That was coming across as passive. I started to find, I guess, more results when I started becoming a lot more independent and taking the lead and taking that initiative as opposed to not. And I think that links with chivalry, and I think that links with just being a man in general, taking the lead, taking initiative.
So what's in the middle, you reckon, for what it is to be an effective masculine man? Because I don't think subscribing to the likes of Andrew Tate is very effective for a society of young boys. I also don't think that tearing out everything that it is to be a man is also effective, and trying to rewrite the script on what are gender roles and what is true masculinity. I think there's something in the middle which speaks to the masses, which is quite relatable and might resonate with a lot of people. So share one thing for you that you've realized is an effective thing to be in a man, that you associate with being an effective and healthy masculine man.
Not being at the whim of your emotions. So not having that victim mentality. When something goes wrong, not crying about it and thinking, woe to me, this is a problem, I can't recover from this, I'm screwed. I think a true man, a true healthy man, a good man, when things don't go his way, when things take a turn that was unexpected, that he didn't want it to take, he just recognizes that as, this is the situation, this is what is. What am I now going to do about it? How am I going to react to it? How am I going to respond? Am I going to react all angry and kick my feet around and walk off in a huff and not talk to anyone about it? Or am I going to recognize that, yep, this has happened, it's a bit shit, but I'm going to respond to it in the best way I can. I'm going to take this and I'm going to make this my responsibility to better in and to adapt and to change, because that's how I want to live my life as a man. I don't want to live life as a man who is at the whim of my emotions. I want to recognize my emotions and act accordingly on that.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because a lot of people might hear that and say, well, this is what's perpetuating the men's mental health stigma, which is, no, it's not really, because we're still saying that men should be in touch with their emotions. They should not numb their emotions. They should express their emotions in very healthy and adaptive ways. But that doesn't mean that these emotions should rule over you and should rule your behaviors and your daily activities and your behaviors, because that's not adaptive and that's unhealthy, frankly. That goes for women as well.
Yeah. Well, this is the ultimate form of being in touch with your emotions. In my opinion, I think in yours as well. You cannot be more in touch with your emotions when you recognize them, when you recognize how you're feeling, you take a breath and you act accordingly based on that. That is the ultimate form of emotional maturity and emotional intelligence, and being vulnerable as a man. You cannot be more vulnerable and emotionally mature than recognizing and acting accordingly like that.
I like that a lot. Something I think about is the ability to protect not just yourself, but those around you. You want to be known as that strength force. Controlled aggression is the key here. You don't want to, as I said before, just lash out at everyone. That's the problem. That's not masculine. But what is masculine is controlling that aggression and knowing how to channel it in protective ways. God forbid there's ever a situation where you're called into action, you're able to channel, any form of self-defense skills. And it doesn't even have to be protection in the sense of physical sense. Protection, the case of, earning enough money so you can protect the livelihood of the family that you've created and that you want to support. So there's many ways you can protect, but the key message is that you're someone that can be a bedrock, someone that you can be relied upon. I know that, Dad, if I need anything, I can lean on him. He's the bedrock of support. Is it a tough role and responsibility? Yeah, but it's not supposed to be easy either. You look at the best male role models in life. They're the ones who tend to endure a lot of things. They tend to be the bedrocks and they tend to be the people that others look to and rely upon when shit hits the fan. They can steer the ship through murky waters, through, unknown currents. That's what I think is an effective man.
Yeah, I think as well, a lot obviously now in society gets spoken about, to what degree should you be vulnerable and emotional as a man? What is the happy medium? And we preface this at the start of the episode as well, in terms of how vulnerable should you be? Because I think you should be vulnerable to an extent. And why I say that is because there's been a lot of forums and recent research that has said that when men are too vulnerable too soon in dating, in relationships, whatever it may be, if they're like trauma dumping and saying everything that they've gone through in the past when, out dating, if it's too early in the dating relationship that they're in, that can actually deter the female. That can actually deter the woman on the date because they might see it as a sign of weakness, a sign of, here is a guy, it's early in our dating and he's just trauma dumping on me and he's expressed a lot of situations where there's no light at the end of the tunnel. There's no strength at the end of the tunnel. And that can be perceived as weakness. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't be vulnerable and you shouldn't express your hardships and maybe your past traumas. But I think it's a key point, and it's an interesting point that maybe we should do it to an extent. And I think it makes sense that you should do it to an extent because you also want to build a foundation first with the person. Nobody wants to be with someone that is just trauma dumping on them in the early stages. I think by building a foundation, a bond, a closeness, and then, peppering with your vulnerability in those early stages and allowing it to come out naturally over time, I think that's the happy medium. And I think that's the perfect balance of being vulnerable and letting your emotions out. I think doing too much too soon has a place for deterrence.
I think it just comes down to basic social skills training as well, right? You saying to people that you need to know how to express your vulnerability in a healthy and adaptive way, especially when you're on a date. There's nothing in that that's saying you shouldn't be vulnerable. It's just saying that you need to be controlled and measured with how you present yourself to other people, especially if you want to have a chance with a specific dating prospect.
It's like when I think of the old VCE English examination questions where, a question is posed and it's always like, do you agree? Or it's a statement and then it's, do you agree? And I remember always getting taught in school that you should open up your arguments by saying to an extent, because it's never 100% yes and it's never 100% no. And I think this is a perfect case of that when it comes to vulnerability as a man and expressing that vulnerability, expressing your emotions is to an extent, because nobody wants to be with someone that is constantly outpouring a whole lot of emotion and heaviness. I think it's always to an extent.
It has to be to an extent because life is more nuanced than black and white, isn't it, Jeremy?
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I don't know. When it comes to masculinity as well, I think something that will probably benefit men as well is being able to confide with other men as well and talk about these things. Because I think a lot of men become insular, especially about these problems. And when it comes to vulnerability, it's good to be vulnerable with other men because the truth of the matter is if you're able to tell someone what you're going through and they can reinforce and say, hey, I've gone through the exact same thing, it does a world of good, especially if those men are too anxious and don't want to communicate that to their partners. There was a project that was done, Men with Sheds.
Yes, the men's shed.
Yeah, like and
started here in Australia.
Excellent initiative, right? Men won't go to therapy, but they'll go build a shed and talk about their feelings whilst drilling some wood into a shed, right?
Fantastic.
I think it's fantastic. So what it shows is that men are happy to express their emotions in different ways. For men, it's doing stuff. It's the great way to develop relationships with their peers. Hands-on, doing something. Because when you're out and you're doing stuff, natural conversation's going to arise anyway. I think that's an excellent way as well. A lot of men don't find the idea of therapy too appealing, and that's okay.
Yeah, well, I think this is a different kind of therapy, and I think this is where this Men's Shed initiative has gained so much traction and so much praise is because as society, men shouldn't be put in the same box as women when it comes to how they should be treated. We might respond differently to different treatments as, women would respond differently to different treatments as well. It's not a one size fits all approach to mental health, to therapy. And this is why it's great. It's just another realm. It's another route which can help a lot of different people.
And what it does show is that men have the capacity to be vulnerable and express their emotions in adaptive ways. That is far more healthier than demonizing a bunch of men saying that, you at your core, you're quite toxic. So I think going down, that former direction is way more effective. And, that's probably the most promising prospect for men.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we think about like role models and people in our lives and the men that we can look to in order to actually think about what is the man I want to be, what are the qualities I want to possess, it doesn't necessarily have to be like your closest family members, which are maybe the ones that we always think about need to be. It doesn't need to be your dad, your brother, your uncle, your grandfather, whatever. Absolutely, a lot of the time it might be and it will be, but it doesn't have to be. It can also be your friends. It can also be that school teacher that you might have had. It can be, that athlete that you see a lot of great qualities in. So I think it's also a nice point to think about that when thinking about what it means to be a good man, look outside the box as well and think about the other people in your circle, in your wider circle, and take different things from different people, because I think that's a key point is that, a lot of people possess different qualities and great qualities. So let's take the great ones and the good ones from different people and diversify what it means to be a man for us.
Love it. Jeremy, tell me, quick fire, what are the 3 things you see in being an effective male?
Compassionate.
I like it.
Taking initiative.
Nice.
I mean, there's so many.
I know.
And third one, I would say being true to yourself.
I love it.
What about you, mate?
So compassionate is something I do really care about, but I like protection, leadership. Might be more than 3, but compassionate, leadership, being able to take initiative and leading by example.
Love it. Love it. And guys, let's open up the conversation. So through the week, we would love to talk about this topic more. So feel free to let us know what are the values you see in what it means to be a good man, how you view masculinity today as well. We would love to hear your opinion and, let us know what you think of ours as well. So if you have enjoyed, if you feel like you would like to share this with someone else that might take benefit from it, by all means do so. We would love that. We'd love, for more people to hear about these topics of conversations. It's really important we talk about them. So thank you to listening. If you've made it all this way, we greatly appreciate you and we can't wait to see you on the next one. Have a good week.
Bye-bye.